and welcome to the week ahead. I'm Tony Nash. Today, we're joined by Albert Marco, Ralph Schulhammer, and Tracy Schuchart. There's a lot going on. Albert just published a piece about Resurgence of Europe, so we're gonna talk about that. We're also going to talk about political betting markets and how relevant they are. We're going to talk about the BRICS Summit and the newfound love between India and China, and we're going to talk about nat gas and revisit some of the things we talked about Tracy with last week on regulation and nat gas and other stuff. So Albert, I'm so glad we have you up first this week. You just published this piece on Cloak and Dagger titled "The Evolving Landscape of Europe," and it's a very long title, so I'm not going to read the whole thing out. It's like a PhD thesis. So I want to talk about the resurgence of the nation state in this. What do you think are the most driving factors of the resurgence of the nation state in Europe, and how do you see it impacting the future of the EU?
Well, the main driver is economics. That's what it boils down to. Europe has had these, green initiatives, these, socially minded, policies that have absolutely just failed left and right. I mean, the best one we can point to is Germany's destruction of nuclear energy. Right? They've sat there and did some, green initiative to cut off all nuclear power, and then all of a sudden, the German economy is basically failing. It's a slow failing process at the moment. And what you see now is other countries like France and the UK and others that are sitting there saying, yeah, we're going to restart these nuclear power plants and so on and so forth, right? And this is flying in the face of the European Parliament, who's pushed for certain policies, and nation states now within the EU are out to look out for themselves. I mean, this is only one instance of it. I could point to 50 others. I mean, Hungary looking towards their economics and Russian fuel, Austria and Austria and the EU, as Ralph knows, have had many issues between each other over the past 2 decades. But yeah, it just as economics become strained and the economies are the economic policies are failing, that national interests will supersede EU interests.
I'm really shocked. I thought you were going to say immigration, but you went to economics, which is
there's a back and forth about immigration in the EU. Their birth rates are so horrific that they do need immigration. I don't agree with allowing everybody in there. I think they should be very selective of who they let in there. But that's a whole different topic that we can address one day.
Right. And so as you talk about the move toward, I guess, the resurgent nation state, when we talk about things like the say the tariffs that the EU wants to impose on Chinese vehicles and other things, that's a union-wide action. But then you have places like Germany who say, no, we really shouldn't have these tariffs. We really want Chinese business, that sort of thing. What's the friction there, and how do you expect things like that? I know Germany has already surrendered their customs kind of enforcement to the EU. So will we see more, say, assertive national powers on things like customs and tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, for that respect, Germany has tied their economic future on China, and like to the point where it's more stubborn than any donkey in the world, right? I mean, the Chinese have stolen every single shred of German technology. They copied it, offered better financing to emerging markets, and still, the Germans have this ridiculous idea that they have to have, this special relationship with Germany, with China, whereas rather they should be focusing on, South America, Africa, and other EMs.
So I mean, if you turn back, say, 10 or 20 years, who would have guessed that Germany would have tied its energy future to Russia and its economic future to China? I mean, I just think that it's just so weird that Germany has completely looking eastward for these things.
Yeah, but I've been saying this for about 10, 15 years,
Yeah,
right? Merkel single-handedly ruined a generation of German wealth, right? There's no question about that. She's unwilling to take initiative and drift away from the Russian fuel dependence and the Chinese market share dependence. If they're unwilling to change, and I mean, what do? You can only lead a horse to water. You can't make it drink.
right. Okay, so in the article you talk about Germany and France kind of parting ways over certain things. Can you give us a quick assessment of in what ways are they kind of separating?
Well, the Germans have always been the bank that fills the EU coffers, and the French have been the administrators that divvy up all the money that they
Right.
don't technically earn. And it's been really favorable for the French, especially now, as Germany's taken quite a step back. But these games of the French versus the Germans is not really going to be very delightful for the EU going forward. I mean, they're really separating their ways. As France looks at Germany as a fallen EU power now. I mean,
So weird to see that.
yeah. I mean, well, I mean, it's not something that wasn't discussed at length for the last 15 years. I mean, you could see it. You could see it happening slowly but surely. I mean, the Germans losing market share in the auto industry around the world. Their factories moving to the United States. You know what I mean. Whatever, and Morocco and whatnot. And the French, they, as much as I don't really like the French all that much, but or anybody
I love
else.
the French, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, listen, they do what they do best for their national interest. They play around. They have a military. They play around in South America. They play around in Africa, and you have to do these things if you want to conduct trade globally.
Jacques Delors is turning in his grave. So do you think we'll have a Gaullist Latin Southern EU versus kind of a Nordic German Northern EU? Do you think that pressure is coming?
That was the case for a long time, up until about maybe 2, 3 years ago, where the lines have now been blended ever since pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, so on, had their issues and Germany bailed them out. Now it's opposite way, where you have a lot of people from Germany and Holland and Scandinavia moving to those countries because it's cheaper to live, taxation is cheaper, right? So now you have a blended issue, a blended union.
Okay. I also want to talk a little bit about the manufacturing shift to Eastern Europe. How does that affect supply chains? Do you see it as a long-term trend, or is this just kind of an interim moment for Europe? Because I remember in the 90s, I was there when they started building out factories in Eastern Europe, and I was a part of building logistics and supply chains for factories there. But then that disappeared when China joined the WTO. Do you think that building manufacturing in the EU, do you think that's something that's at least medium-term viable, or do you think it's really just a short-term kind of hedge?
No, it's definitely medium-term viable. I mean, it's cheaper. There's less regulations. There's less taxations. The governments are more accommodating to corporations that move in there, right? I mean, Austria's, I think it was OWI, fuel is in Albania, right? And they have the run of the mill. I mean, they control pretty much everything in terms of fuel over there, right? The Raiffeisen Bank is over there. They're starting to build small factories, textiles and auto parts in Spain and whatnot. And it's just cheaper, Tony. I mean, this is the same thing that the United States has with Mexico and in other countries. Is the cheaper, less regulation, cost of wages for labor is a lot cheaper also.
Yep. Ralph, you're sitting there very politely silent as we talk about issues in your backyard. So can you talk to us a little bit about manufacturing in Eastern Europe? How, at what pace is that happening, do you think? And do you think that's something that's viable over the long term?
Well, I think one thing that we have to talk about, and I think Albert alluded to it, is of course that despite Germany's decline, they're still the behemoth in Europe. I mean, their industrial production is still the same as Italy's and France's combined. So the issue is going to be when the Germans go down, how many are they going to drag down with them? I think somebody did a very wonderful graph on X recently, where they said of all the surrounding Eastern European countries, it takes 13 of those countries to come to the same GDP as Germany has at the moment. Plus, this is maybe on a more uplifting note. I mean, this is difficult with heavy industries, again, manufacturing, cars, steel, petrochemical industries, but there are elections in Germany next year. There will be a change in government. Now, my hopes are not too high, as Albert correctly mentioned. I mean, I think the person who really stood at the cradle of all the problems Germany is having at the moment is Angela Merkel, and she was from the Conservative Party. So the hopes that the Conservative Party being back in power will make a 180. Let's say I'm not convinced of it, but sometimes, right, there is the normative power of the factual. So pretty much everybody, with the exception of Robert Habeck, the current Minister of the Economy in Germany, agrees that things cannot go on the way they're currently moving. And so I'm a little bit more hopeful. And the last point, just real quick to your original question, there is more going on in Eastern Europe than generally catches the eye. For example, Romania, in a town called Koloshvar, they actually have a significant IT industry. It's not Silicon Valley, of course, but for Romania, it is quite significant. They have created a very impressive local incentives to keep companies there. American companies do a lot of long distance work with programmers and software engineers in Romania that work for American companies. I'm currently in Hungary. There is not necessarily my favorite industry, but they do it nonetheless. Battery factories and EV construction is growing in Hungary. BYD is planning to make its first European factory in Hungary. Poland, I would argue, is still experiencing the Polish economic miracle. We'll see how long that is going to last, but for the moment, it's still going on. But I have to return to my original point, which is that all of this, and I think Albert said it perfectly, all of this, of course, was to some extent bankrolled by the might of the German economy.
Sure. I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe in the 90s, and I remember going into Budapest and Romania and other places, Prague. The Germans really built out a lot of electrical infrastructure and commercial infrastructure. They came in and they rebuilt the metro in Prague. I mean, that was an amazing time for Eastern Europe. And for the Germans to kind of turn around and forget all of that sunk cost and just focus on China, it's really astounding to me. But that's effectively what's been done. So,
but if you compare it to sorry, just a quick point. But if you compare it to Helmut Kohl or Konrad Adenauer, like for them, always the connection to the United States, kind of the orientation towards the West, was a fundamental building block of German foreign policy, and it is true. I mean, Trump was right on this. What everyone thinks about Trump in other areas, but he was right about this. Under Angela Merkel, Germany turned eastwards. There can be no doubt about this. It was partially, I think, also pushed by German companies because, as Albert correctly said, they had this weird idea that somehow they're going to take over the Chinese economy or whatever their vision was. But there was also this political aspect of it, of a new orientation away from the US towards Russia. That did happen. I think even now everybody tries to memory hold this in Germany, but that did happen.
And there's no doubt that German companies and European companies saw disproportionate growth in China. You look at what Volkswagen did with the Shanghai Auto and the early success they had in Shanghai, and all this other stuff. That's their growth. You could say the same thing about GM and their success in China, but European companies in particular saw amazing success. Guys like Henkel, other guys saw amazing success in China, and where home wasn't growing, China became their growth market. So I can see both sides of it, right? But part of what I was going to ask you, Ralph, is you're sitting in Hungary, which one could argue is pretty aligned with China and has been, involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, and is, factories like BYD are being built there. But it seems that Hungary still has a relatively, nationalist or whatever type of view. So Hungary plays that pretty deftly. Is that, I mean, I'm not saying they're necessarily doing it right, but they're playing a balancing act with their relationship with the EU and with China and with elsewhere.
Well, let's put it this way: they try to play the balancing act. Right? I think
Okay.
the European Union is not too happy with them, and the European Union is constantly withholding also potential funds that I think, from a legal perspective, the Hungarians would be entitled to. But politics is a messy business. The Hungarian situation is a tricky one because we Austrians know this. We spent a lot of time together with them in one state. The Hungarians are by nature contrarians. So there's a certain desire on their part. Like, if everybody say we go left, there will be one Hungarian who says, I think we should go right. And this is also, I know, again, it sounds like a cliche, but these things matter in politics because, and it also comes historically. The Hungarians are literally an island in Europe. They're not Germanic, they're not Slavic, they're not Romanic. Like, they're a very, very unique thing. They still do have this idea that they are more or less besieged from all sides. So for them, this is also a reasserting of their sovereignty.
Yeah.
I would say this is in smaller doses true for many Eastern European countries. And this brings us to another topic we probably have to speak about another day, which is that the EU has fundamentally changed with the expansion towards the east, with 10 new members from formerly Central and Eastern Europe in 2004. Because they have a completely different historical experience due to communism. I welcome that input. I think that this new emphasis on national sovereignty is a good thing. But of course, it is very different from the unspoken consensus that the only Western European Union had until 2004.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So you bring up kind of the communist history, and the EU is nothing if it isn't kind of a social contract, right? So, Albert, you talked about EU countries struggling to sustain their social programs. And really, what is Europe? What is the EU without free healthcare? So what political risks do you see governments facing as they try to balance kind of their fiscal responsibility, if there is such a thing anymore, with social welfare? And how could this new nationalism kind of exacerbate relationships within the EU?
Oh, that's tough. I mean, that you really have to go on a country by country basis. I mean, that can just point towards Germany, which is, the easiest target. But they're under a lot of pressure from the United States and NATO to up their spending to to levels that are acceptable. However, they really don't have the money to do such a thing and keep their social programs in place. Now, the social programs is what keeps them in power with their own voters and demographics. So they're obviously not going to take money away from that. So it's really convoluted and really tough to talk about an EU-wide thing. But basically, it's social programs or fiscal responsibility. But the fiscal responsibility for the Europeans is laughable because they always get bailouts from the U.S. Fed. So it's there's no need to even bother with that.
Yeah, I think if you jump to the ahead a little bit, and you have this new nationalism, and you have, let's say, somebody in a wealthy country supporting the social programs of a EU country in the South, at some point, it's going to break. It seems to me.
You would think, but those nationalists have to win power, and they have yet to win power in any big decision-making country. France, no. Germany, laughable. Holland, no. I mean, it's like they still have to win power in a parliamentary system, divided up by many left-wing parties and a few right-wing parties that are unable to get the majority to form governments.
Okay, so my question is, and there are a lot of big European companies traded on U.S. exchanges, and as I said a couple weeks ago, I have a friend who's German. He's on a lot of German corporate boards, and he's just exasperated with the level of regulation and almost bullying from the government. What is the play for companies in Europe? Like, is there a way around the huge government and all the regulations? Are there companies that you're seeing outside of, say, green energy companies that are actually succeeding extraordinarily well, given this really complicated environment?
The only ones that are, I'm not going to name names, but the only ones that do well with that are the ones that have the most the most workers and can affect the most votes for a particular country. I mean, specifically in Germany again, you have a company like Volkswagen that's talking about getting rid of all their factories and whatnot, and the German government immediately up in attention because
Right.
they have to figure out what they're going to do with all those unemployed people.
Yep. Ralph, what observations do you have? What type of company or what companies are navigating that well?
Well, what's a little bit frustrating, and I agree with Albert was saying, but of course, a little bit the regulation that happened in Europe was also the fault of those companies because, let's call it an unspoken secret, is that of course some companies said if we have a strong regulatory state, they will create conditions that make it almost impossible for any startup or any new coming company to enter the market. Because before you can do anything, whatever field it is you want to enter the market, you need 20 lawyers that help you to get to 20,000 pages of regulation. And that's, of course, a very, very effective way to kind of pull up the ladder, right? Once you have established yourself in the market. There is European decline, if you want to use that term. There was a lot of collusion going on, not just by, let's call it, incompetent politicians, but also by companies who thought that, at least in the short term, they can make it comfortable for themselves under these conditions. And I think this has been the big miscalculation. I also agree fully with Albert. And
those types of
sorry?
companies. What sector would those type of companies?
Well, I would say the banking sector. I would say the IT sector, and also in manufacturing in many ways. I think it really is across the board.
Tracy, I wanted to come to you on energy companies, particularly natural resources companies. There are some big ones based in Europe, and given the complexities and the transition to nationalism that Albert's talking about, what are energy companies and natural resources companies that are based in Europe doing? Are they just doing as little operation in Europe as possible, or how are they coping?
I mean, that really depends on where you're looking. If you're looking at the UK, for example, those companies are looking to leave the UK because of the huge tax burden and because of how the UK wants to regulate the oil and gas industry into oblivion and shut down North Sea production. So, that's one part of it. And for the most part, a lot of the countries within the EU already have nationalized energy or utility companies, so that doesn't really affect them so much. And then really the other big one that you have is Norway, who, despite all of their climate goals, that is the bread and butter of their pension. So they are definitely, not going to stop oil and gas drilling, aside from the fact that the government likes to talk about the fact that they are regulating things. And I have to hand it, it's a very green city. They have a lot of EV vehicles and things of that nature, but that doesn't necessarily mean the country is going to give up their pension cash load. I think what's really interesting that we kind of need to re-examine again, if we're looking at energy costs in general in Europe this year, is the fact that, European natural gas just hit a new high for this year. And they got really, really lucky last year because we had a very mild winter. Everybody thought we're just going to sail on through this. But right now, what we're experiencing, we have an unplanned Norway outage. We have LNG from the United States delayed because of the export license delays that we have here. We have Egypt flipped from a net exporter to a net importer. So they're taking a lot of supply, particularly from Algeria, which the EU was reliant on. And we have at the very end of the year, the Russia-Ukraine gas transit deal ending and winter's coming. And so, I think we need to look at this in general and say, Europe may be in big trouble, in particular Germany, which is already had, kind of a crushing blow since 2022 because of high energy prices. And so, this year might be very devastating towards industry in the EU.
Yeah, I mean BASF had issues 2 years ago with the Rhine and the energy costs and whatnot, and they took a nasty hit. It was a pretty significant blow to the German economy at that point.
Yep.
I can't even imagine a second round of something like that happening.
Oh yeah, and I can't. The last segment of this show, we're going to talk about nat gas, so we'll get into a lot more details on that. But yeah, I mean, it's so. I guess my bigger question was in terms of, say, the regulation and the kind of rising nationalism. But Tracy, what you talk about with Norway was perfect because it's a conundrum for them, right? That's where they get a lot of their money, but that's not where their heart is. So, their head and their heart are going to have a real problem at some point. So let's move on. Since we've got Albert and he's our political expert, I want to move on to an issue around U.S. Elections. We have seen over the last couple of months a lot of these political betting markets.
Oh boy.
And so I have a poly market chart on screen right now, and you and I have talked about a little bit of this personally, but help me understand, Albert, what is the difference between a betting market chart and a poll, just in very basic terms?
I mean, a poll actually polls people. A betting market is tracking the number of bets on a single candidate, right? The problem with that is, as we saw today, I think it was an hour ago, the biggest whale in the poly market was a $45 million bet by a French guy. Right. So it's just
Right.
like how do you extrapolate something where the world is betting on something based on skewed polls and skewed media attention, right? So it's just like what are we trying to talk about here? I mean, there's nothing really there in the betting markets. It's just people betting money and on the whims and narratives of political operatives. I mean, if the polls shift towards Kamala over the weekend, the market shifts again. It's like who's leading who at this point, So
Yep.
I don't put any credibility in the betting market whatsoever.
Okay. I mean, that has been a big factor on social media and with some of these polling companies. You see these polling companies and political commentators coming with the polls, but they're also coming with this betting market information. And I think a lot of people are looking at this, and it's really a binary bet. Will candidate A win or will candidate B win? And it's really, I think, more of a sentimental than a factual type
Of course it is.
impact.
Of course it is. It's the same thing if you go and bet on NFL games. You know what I mean? It's like you're betting on your home team because you love them, right? You're not betting because you're looking at the actual, statistics and data and whatnot.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to the BRICS Summit. Ralph, you wrote an interesting piece on the BRICS Summit recently, and there was this Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi meeting where everyone supposedly ended it with hugs and kisses, and they're never going to have a border issue again. And anybody who watches this knows our bias. I would say bias against the BRICS, not necessarily bias against the BRICS, but I would say skepticism against the supremacy of the BRICS versus, say, the dollar system or whatever. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us, what is your kind of main message from your recent piece on BRICS?
Well, I think you said it quite nice. I think none of us has a bias against the countries that constitutes the BRICS. I think, and I dare here to speak for Albert as well, I think we have a strong bias against kind of Western commentators who constantly want to talk up the BRICS as if it's this new kind of alternative alliance or whatnot. So my main takeaway, and I think this is for me, because I talked to Michael Cowell, right, to Brent, like old friends of your show and of all of us here. And I think one of the key takeaways is that the best way to take BRICS seriously is that the member states see it not as an alliance or a growing institution like the EU, where gradually countries hand over responsibility to a supranational institution. At best, they see it as a potential means to reinforce their own sovereignty. And I think that is the big difference. You have, as flawed as they might be, but most alliances in the West, whether it's NATO, whether it's the EU or similar institutions, they have been created with the intention that individual countries hand over power to these new institutions.
Right.
Within BRICS, if you take a close look, nobody has that intention. I would go even further and say that the main purpose of the member states is to make sure that they don't have to hand anything over. Now, it is true that they talk about payment systems and all of this, but again, they talk about this in the context of shielding their currencies and economies from potential pressure from the United States. So this is a very, going back to what you discussed just a minute before with Albert, right? Kind of this new nationalism kind of thing. BRICS, in a sense, you could argue, is an international attempt to reinforce a nationalist or a national interest-based foreign policy.
This is interesting, but let me take the other side for a minute. And Tracy, that you have China, who is the kind of marginal consumer of energy globally now. You have Russia, who is a huge producer of natural gas and crude and metals and these sorts of things. You have India, India, which is a huge global supplier of services. And so you do have countries that can have a serious economic impact in BRICS, right? I mean, they're not going anywhere, right, in terms of their global economic impact. Is that right, Tracy?
Yeah, but they're all playing. It's not like any of these countries are leaving any sort of Western country out. Well, particularly the United States. I mean, the United States and India still have a great relationship. They buy a lot of energy from us. Yeah, they buy a lot of energy from Russia, but that relationship's really because that kind of balances out China within the region. And that relationship is old as the hill. So for, the United States to kind of get in the middle of that relationship is not really, it wasn't really our business, in other words, to begin with. And we did see last year they backed off of that a little bit. At first the United States kind of gave India a lot of flack for buying Russian cheap oil, and they kind of backtracked on that and said, okay, that's fine, you can go ahead and do that. Not that they needed our permission to do so,
right.
But
and they buy Iranian oil all the time, so.
And so, yeah, exactly, and sell it back. And so, I think those, there was, and China again buys a lot of agriculture from the United States.
Yep.
A lot, buys a lot of energy from the United States. And so, it's not like these countries are, and Russia was too before we cut them off of everything and, et cetera, et cetera. But, and so it's not like these countries are giving up their relationships with the West either at the same time. And even if you look at the list of the new members, right, all of those countries also have relationships with the West. And so, I think for them, it's a win-win situation where they can be part of this alliance and part of this alliance and reap the benefits of both, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, there does seem to be Russia, I think, is there by necessity. China is there by desire. I think India is there as an observer more than anything, right? And so, and then you look at like Brazil, and they're kind of just, they're there for the party. I mean, if you look at the different BRICS participants, I think people want kind of observer status. I mean, outside of Russia and India, people want observer status, but I'm not really sure how much they're engaging, and it's really hard to tell from official channels how much they're actually engaging.
What I find interesting is, of all the 13 new countries that have been given partner status, none of them are really that surprising. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Algeria,
Right.
Bolivia, Cuba, etc. But Turkey is very interesting.
Right.
Because, but it's not like Erdogan doesn't play both sides all the time, but that's
Always.
very interesting given that that's pretty much the only NATO member.
Right. That's interesting.
involved.
Albert, you know Turkey really well. Why would they do that?
Turkey moves to its own beat, right? It's stuck in the most geostrategic position in the world. It's going to play not both sides. It'll play five sides if it has to. It plays the Iranians, it plays the Iraqis, it plays the Russians, it plays the Europeans, it plays the United States, and no one can say anything because of where it's strategically positioned, right?
Yep.
I mean, there's so much Russian fuel in Turkish tanks right now, and nobody can say a damn thing.
Yeah.
100%.
Nobody.
Yeah, I think Turkey and India have very similar, although they're not really compared very much, but I think they have very similar kind of very multi-partner approaches to geopolitics. And that's one thing that from the BRICS, I get the geoeconomic significance of these countries for sure. I get the geoeconomic significance, but the geopolitical significance, I'm not sure that they have the geopolitical impact that's assumed. Does China really have diplomatic partners? Maybe they do. I mean, aside from North Korea and Pakistan and maybe Cambodia and Myanmar, I'm trying to think of serious hardcore geopolitical bilateral partnerships that China has outside of economic necessity. So do you see, Ralph, from a geopolitical perspective, BRICS bringing on the heft of, say, a NATO or something like that?
I think an unspoken secret is, and I think that's particularly true on part of the Chinese, and Tony, you know more about this than I do, so I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this. But behind closed doors, I would assume that, in fact, many countries, including many BRICS members, are not entirely unhappy about the world being led by the United States. It's always easy to criticize the United States. Everybody does it. It's always enjoyable. But overall, the stability that is provided by a United States that acts in a self-confident way has been to the benefit of everyone. I mean, China's economic rise would not have been possible without the United States. I don't think that the Chinese would, even if they could, like to replace the dollar, because the relationship with the dollar as it is has worked very much to their advantage, at least for now. Then Russia, I mean, a country that's in a condition of war is just not really well positioned to lead a new alliance. I mean, this is just as Albert has pointed this out very often on his X account. I mean, again, apart from some commentators on the internet that try somehow to talk of Russia to being this super mighty power, at the end of the day, they did not lose in Ukraine, but they also didn't really win. I mean, the expectation was that they're going to roll in and it's going to be done, and they didn't. So the mighty Russians are not as mighty, and I think they themselves, of course, know this as well.
Well, they've got North Koreans fighting for them, so they
yeah. I mean, I guess North Korea will be happy. This sounds cynical, but I believe that North Korea will be happy if they have some fewer mouths to feed, because they have these problems. So I guess that's a little bit approach that they have. But overall, as I said before, the excitement about a new world order, as far as I can tell, is much higher in the West than outside the West.
Yeah,
like, there are not that many takers in non-Western countries about this supposed world order, and a lot of it is not. Remember, it was a couple of months ago. Remember, there was this huge headliner. What was it? Saudi Arabia finished the agreement about the petrodollar, which was a complete hoax. There never was an agreement. But immediately Western media jumped on it. Oh, this is so exciting. This is
people are still talking about it today.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Literally not
Ralph,
even
what you raised about Ralph, what you raised about criticism is a good point. As China gets more involved in geopolitics, if people were to criticize China, let's say Iran were to criticize China about a statement they made about Palestine and Israel, it wouldn't go well for Iran, right? Whereas Israel can criticize the U.S. and the U.S. just keeps moving forward. So I think that's a fair point. I want to really quickly, because I want to get on to our last segment. We've gone on for a while. So really quickly, I want to cover the India-China border issue. So if you can, Albert's talked about this for years. So Albert, if you can get us started, and then Ralph and Tracy, if you can comment on it as well. But I'd like to hear, do you think this is a solution that will last? Where do you think this goes from here?
I don't think it's got much legs anyways. It's not worth the toilet paper, basically. I mean, You're talking about 1 billion people on one side and 1 billion people on the other side that are looking to harvest all that watershed from the Himalayan mountains. That's not addressed. That's the root of the problem.
Yeah.
Right. And that hasn't been addressed. They're just talking about some kind of border agreement. Like, oh yeah, okay. They're both going to hold hands. One eating General Tso's chicken, the other one eating chicken curry, and sitting there like talking over dinner at the border. This is not how the Chinese and the Indians work. Right. There is serious water and geopolitical problems between the two people, and it's not going to be resolved over a handshake and dinner. Right. This is just buying time for whatever BRICS nonsense they want to put out. But
do you believe either side believes that it's the solution?
Oh God, no, okay. No. Absolutely not. If they would, they would take away their militaries off their mountaintop bases, and none of them is doing that.
Nobody's doing that. Yeah. Ralph, Tracy, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just have one can add on. I think Albert is absolutely right, and you saw it in another respect as well. I think that they came out with a statement condemning Israel or something, and while they made the statement, India is still delivering drones and other equipment to Israel. So a lot of this, again, Russia needed a PR win. I think they got the PR win. I think that we can hand to them. But is there going to be? And they did not even as far as I can tell, they didn't even cross the issue of new payment, new currency, that everybody was holding their breath, that the new gold commodity backed currency is going to come. So yeah, PR, well done, because it's an exciting issue, great for the clickbait and consulting crowd in the West, but lasting consequences, not maybe next year, but I don't think from this particular meeting.
Great. Okay. Well, so let's move on to energy. Tracy, I want to go back for a minute to our conversation from last week where you were talking about Europe's energy policies versus the US's energy policies. You had this great tweet about Europe having to face the consequences for its energy policies. It talks about how Europe is ditching the costs of, or bearing the cost of ditching Russian LNG. And it's the CEO of Total Energies basically saying that it's the fault of politicians, not of his companies. So he's kind of dodging the bullet for consumers. Is there really anything here new to this, or is he just kind of blaming politicians for price rises?
No, this is like in response to a new set of sanctions that may or may not happen that Europe's talking about, where, because they still import LNG from Russia. Not a lot, but, and that passes through different countries as well as being directly shipped into Europe. And so Europe is, deciding whether or not to cut LNG off in general. And so Total was pretty much like, yes, we understand this needs to happen, but, this is a really stupid mistake.
Yeah.
Because once again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. You have TTF, nat gas prices rising. You cut off your LNG imports from Russia without other long-term contracts coming online. He was basically saying, yes, I understand this needs to happen, but there's going to be a huge price for this. And so again, it
wasn't just 2022.
No, this again, like, this is, if this comes to fruition, then, be prepared for another huge energy problem. In other words, is what he was saying.
Right. So last night you had this tweet where you just said Natty Sh. So can you, I love it when you do stuff like that. So
because it jumped and I was like, oh my God. It's really, and it was in the overnight, and actually it's up again today. And so, I think it's up 5% as we're talking about right now. Whenever you see a jump like that, it's, very interesting for US nat gas traders. But in all seriousness, I think there's some really positive things going on. Aside from the export license, we have 3 new gas pipelines that are taking away the glut in the Permian to the Gulf Coast. Great. That's going to relieve a lot of that negative pressure on some of those other grades that you don't hear about that often, such as Waha. And so I think there's some really, really good things going on in the natural gas industry in the US. Why are prices so depressed? Well, we produce a lot of it. Right. And what's happening with our shale gas production is that, the more we prolong these wells, the more we burn through this kind of tier 1 acreage, the kind of gassier and gassier these wells come. So we're producing lighter and lighter stuff, which is great for, chemical processing, right, for LNG and things of that nature. Not so great, as use as oil. But so I think, I think we're kind of set to see natural gas over the next 12 to 18 months. I think we'll see, get off the floor, depending on who is elected. I would say that, a Trump win would be much better for the natural gas industry, because as we know, that export license pause would be taken off the table immediately, and companies can go back to building out. But we're still seeing a lot of build out regardless. We just saw Brownsville, Texas just got a $43 million loan to build out their port. They need to dredge it to get those bigger ships in. And so, it seems like the industry is kind of going ahead with the preliminary stuff, even with those export licenses kind of on hold right
Tracy,
now.
can you tell us a little bit more about these 3 pipelines that you mentioned? Who's operating them? What are they doing? Are they all going to South Texas?
So they're all in Texas. Yeah, they're all from the Permian. So we have the KMI is the newest one, and then 2 from Western, I think. Oh my God, sorry guys. I don't have it off the top of my head. It's not
That's
a
okay. So,
not a
and where is that gas
company.
going? Sorry, go
So
ahead.
yeah, so there basically it's going from the Permian, which is kind of like New Mexico. If you look at New Mexico, Texas border, in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
So it's kind of going from that area, from the upper western-ish region down to the Gulf. So where you have takeaway capacity, whether that be through, gasifying it and sending it on LNG ships, or you can, put that in tankers and, send it up onto the East Coast, for example.
Okay. And that's going to Europe, China, Japan, Korea. Where is that stuff going to mostly?
Everywhere. Well,
Okay.
especially Europe right now is our largest buyer of LNG. And so certainly that, but we're certainly, we're still sending LNG to Japan, of course, even though, they've cut back on purchases, but Asia for certain, and Europe are really the biggest buyers of our LNG right now.
Okay. Is the U.S. still the largest crude producer? Because we hit that kind of in, I think it was this year, 23 or something. Are we still doing that?
We are still doing that because our competition was Saudi Arabia and Russia. And,
Right.
Russia is still producing a lot, but, they have some problems. So they've cut back on production a little because they're part of the OPEC Plus. We all know that Saudi Arabia, part of the deal, has, cut back 2 million barrels per day on, their top of the line production. And so, yes, the North America has surpassed both of them. And a lot of that, again, has to do with Russian sanctions and the OPEC Plus deal.
Okay. So because the U.S. has such a glut of nat gas, is it cheaper? Is U.S. nat gas cheaper than, say, Qatari nat gas or something like that? Is there a price arbitrage there?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly if you look at JKM, which is the Japanese Korea marker, right, which is the Asian marker, or TTF, which is the European marker. Our natural gas prices are 5 times lower than
Really? So
yes.
even with transport, it's still a lot cheaper.
A lot cheaper. A lot.
Okay.
We're trading at, $2.47. TTF is trading right now at 40 euros. So
okay. Wow. Okay, so I didn't realize there was that magnitude of difference between those.
and I would say it's a little bit less because their measurements are a little bit different than ours when we're talking about it. But it's still, again, we're at least 5 times cheaper, even with the cost of transportation and all the in insurance, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow. Okay. So let's take that from a geopolitical perspective. If we can get more pipelines from the coast, the U.S. can have more impact on the global nat gas environment, right? And
yes,
countries, are consuming more LNG and more nat gas. So that could be a geopolitical tool for the U.S.
Absolutely, it can, especially when you have, countries like Egypt right now, once again, becoming an exporter to an importer.
Right.
Right.
Indonesia, the same, right?
Yes. And so you know, and we're seeing some problems in production in Africa, which also has a lot of natural gas, but, Nigeria is a disaster zone right now. Libya is hit or miss depending on what day it is and who's trying to vie for government power. Right. And so, there's a lot of instability in particularly, Africa, where the US can take place. In fact, this is what I will be talking about on November 20th in New Orleans.
So, really? Tell us about that. Tracy's Global Speaking Tour.
So I'll be talking about how North America is kind of poised for leadership in the global energy crunch right now.
Okay, that's fantastic. So that's not just gas, that's crude as well?
No, I'm going to be talking natural gas.
Okay.
I'm going to be talking nuclear, and I'm also going to be talking battery storage technology.
Okay. So speaking of nuclear, I saw that Bangladesh had their first, and you tweeted about this, their first nuclear plant built by the Russians, and that was, I think, completed this week. I know that Bangladesh has had a lot of problems, and I know Bangladesh is kind of an afterthought for most people, but they've literally had to shut their electricity grid down because of LNG delays in the past.
Absolutely.
So when a country like Bangladesh gets a nuclear power plant and it gives more stability to their grid, what does that do for them? I mean, I know that sounds like a stupid question, but what is
that's great for them. And there's a second one coming online as well. But, obviously when you're talking about emerging markets,
right,
sort of poorer nations, this lifts them out of poverty because, yes, it's expensive to build at the beginning, but it gives them cheap, clean energy, reliable, no wind, solar,
right,
intermittent BS, this is consistent power for them. So this is great news for them and lifts them out. It's really interesting that, the Russians were in charge of this project. They're also in charge of the second project. But I think this is great news for that area in general. I think we'll see a lot more developments, particularly in that region because, because again, it lifts them out of, if you look at like Pakistan also couldn't buy natural. I mean, they were like banned from buying natural gas because they had no credit anymore because they defaulted on payments. And so, this is great news. I hope we see more, nuclear technology, no matter who is building it for these regions, because, there's a lot of people in this world, we take it for granted that we have power at, the flip of a light switch, but not the rest of the planet is not so lucky.
We don't take it for granted in Texas. I have a generator in my backyard. So I have a question for all you guys. And I'll start with you, Tracy. Does Europe or China or Japan care if they're buying American nat gas or Russian nat gas or Qatari nat gas? Do they have a preference on the origin of the energy, or are they more focused on the price? I know they have long-term contracts, but if they didn't have long-term contracts, would they care about the origin of the energy if it really just came down to price?
I don't think anybody cares about the origin of the energy except for the EU. I don't think, except for the, and maybe not even individual countries, but certainly the European Commission, let's put it that way.
And so by the EU, do you mean former German prime ministers who are working on the boards of Russian energy companies? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. I'm talking about the unelected bureaucrats that run the
So why does the EU care? Why do those bureaucrats care?
Because it's Russia. We hate Russia. Russia's the bad person. We hate Russia. We have to wean ourselves off of Russian energy. And, which is fine. I'm not going to argue this point. I don't want to get into like a political discussion over this at all. I think that, I think the whole world deserves energy. So let's just put it that way. And I don't really, it doesn't really matter where it comes from as long as it's helping people.
Tony, if I can interject, I mean, I would be like 70% it's all about price, and 30% it's about who it comes from, only if that could advance your geopolitical interests as a nation.
Okay.
But mostly it's all about price. That's all they care about.
Okay. Ralph, what do you think? Does your average European care where their nat gas comes from?
No, the average, and I think Tracy's absolutely right. The bureaucrats might do, the average Europeans don't. What they look at their monthly energy bills, and they want them to go down and not to go up. And this has been one of the main reasons. I would still argue that public opinion is shifting regarding the war in Ukraine. If it affects your pocketbook, right, then all of a sudden it becomes important. One of the things that Tracy has mentioned that I think is going to be super interesting in the years to come is, right, the United States are becoming a leading, or are already actually a leading energy producer. If Argentina and Venezuela in the next 5, 10, 15 years get their act together as well, and if California, which I think could be just like Texas, gets its act together, I'm one. Okay, what?
I wish it won't happen.
Won't happen.
What's going to happen? What's going to happen to OPEC? I mean, I think one of the big geopolitical questions of the future is one of the reasons why the United States, I believe, were so engaged in the Middle East was because of its energy resources. But the United States are, I mean, of course, it's a global market, but the kind of dependency that until 20 years ago everybody expected the US would have on the Middle East is gone, right? They no longer depend on them. So if I would be, these OPEC meetings, I would be worried, let's put it this way, about the future, because the dominant energy. I just today listened to a podcast with a British general, and he was droning on about how crucial the Middle East from an energy perspective. And I don't know what you guys think. I mean, it's still relevant, but it's no longer the 90s or early 2000s. There are now many alternatives, and they give more and not less.
I wouldn't underestimate the importance of the Middle East. Tracy, what do you think about that?
I wouldn't underestimate, because I think it's still
it moves markets, Tracy, right? I mean, it would move markets. And that's
it moves markets. It's still power. It's like whoever controls the spice controls the world.
Yes.
That's a reference from Doom. I mean, but it's still, whoever controls the energy controls the world. And so I think that it's still an important hub. But I think that's evolving into something. So I agree with Ralph that it is evolving into other things. And that's why I think we're seeing, Saudi Arabia in particular kind of branching out into these other areas. They want to become a tourist hub. They're building out Nome. They're going to, they have all these other projects done. They're looking now at, they're issuing mineral drilling rights like crazy right now, because they want to start drilling for that. They have a lot of mineral assets that they've just never dug for, because they didn't have to, because oil was their mainstay, oil and gas is the mainstay. And so if you look at Saudi Arabia, they are branching out into other areas, and they're not, and it's not just Saudi Arabia. I mean, we're seeing this kind of across the Middle East and those GCC nations.
Yep. Yeah, and interesting, and I know we need to end this, but Qatar has a massive gold deposit that no one ever talks about. So these countries have a lot of metals and minerals.
So does Yemen.
Right, and nobody ever talks about these things.
Yeah, and they just haven't really pursued it because they haven't needed to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that very interesting note, guys, let's wrap it up. So thank you so much. This has been a fantastic discussion. Safe travels, everyone. And thanks again. Have a great weekend. Have a great week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.